I'm Stephan Schwartz. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the SchwartzReport. This week, I want to talk about non-local consciousness and exceptional experiences. I want to talk about the experiences that people have that change our science, change our history, change our art, change our religions. Because I think it's trying to tell us something very important about who we are. Where does creative genius come from? Where does spiritual epiphany come from? Where do psychic experiences come from? Now I want to note that psychic is not a word that I use because there is so much misinformation about it. I would say non-local consciousness or non-local perception. But just so everybody understands what I'm talking about, psychic, non-local consciousness, non-local perception. For almost 200 years, the most intellectually rigorous approach we have had for examining the world, science, has had a strong bias toward reductive materialism. And throughout that time, materialism, physicalism, has been unable to answer a very hard question. What is the nature of consciousness? And how are we to explain those exceptional experiences those individuals have? From a materialist physicalist perspective, consciousness is purely a process in one's neuroanatomy. Spiritual ecstasy is really mostly seen as a delusion, and creative processes are the results of genetics, which give you a level of intelligence or social reinforcements. It has nothing to do with an aspect of consciousness outside of space and time. And yet, from time immemorial, these experiences have been reported across geography, culture, and the people who have them all talk about consciousness and having an experience of consciousness, which is different than normal waking consciousness. And since much of our history has been shaped by these men and women who've had these experiences, it seems to me both necessary and important that we understand them and the processes which cause them to occur. And if we retain the rigor of science, and I don't want to abandon it, expanding our perspective is the key. It isn't that science is wrong, it's that it's been inadequate, because it does not incorporate consciousness as causal and fundamental. So one place to start in seeking to understand these experiences is in the words of the men and women to whom history accords the title creative genius, spiritual leader, prophet, or psychic. So let's start with the scientists. And we can start with Max Planck, the father of quantum mechanics. He was very clear. He said, I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. We cannot get behind consciousness. Everything that we talk about, everything that we regard as existing, postulates consciousness. Was he alone? He was not. And I think that's important in and of itself. Consider Albert Einstein, father of relativity. When he talked about it, he said, there's a quote, a human being is part of the whole, called by us universe, a part limited in time and space. He experiences himself, his thoughts, his feelings, as something separated from the rest, a kind of optical delusion, I love that, of his consciousness. This is delusion it's a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for a few persons nearest us. And he continued, our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty. Nobody's able to achieve this completely, but the striving for such an achievement is in itself a part of liberation and a foundation for inner security. Albert Einstein sounds like someone who is an ecologist, or someone today who is arguing about respecting and recognizing the matrix of life. How interesting that these people who we think of as great scientists, who made these big breakthroughs, they themselves, when they talked about it, talk about consciousness and the interconnection and interdependence of life. Wolfgang Pauli, it is my personal opinion, he said, that in the science of the future, reality will be neither psychic nor physical, but somehow both and somehow neither. Let's look at some creative artists. Johann Brahms, one of the great musicians and composers of European history, of world history, a man whose music affected the world. He was clear. He said, I quote him, in this exalted state, I see clearly what is obscure in my ordinary moods. And then I feel capable of drawing inspiration from above, as Beethoven did. And Mozart, by the way, and also Copland. Those vibrations assume the form of distinct mental images. Straight away, the ideas flow in upon me. And not only do I see distinct themes in the mind's eye, but they are clothed in the right forms, harmonies, orchestration. Measure by measure, the finished product is revealed to me when I am in these rare inspired moods. I have to be in a semi-trance condition to get such results, a condition when the conscious mind is in temporary abeyance and the subconscious is in control, for it is through the subconscious mind, which is part of the omnipotence, that the inspiration comes. Now, what he means by the subconscious is non-local perception, non-local consciousness, the same kind of thing that the scientists were talking about. William Blake, if the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to be as it is infinite. You look at saints and mystics. Saint Teresa of Avila. This is talking about a medieval woman, part of the Roman Catholic Church. And yet, when asked what was going on, what inspired her, what informed her, what guided her, she said, this magnificent refuge is inside of us. Enter, shatter the darkness, the shrouds, the doorway. Be bold, be humble. Put away the incense. Forget the incantations you were taught. Ask no permission from the authorities. Close your eyes, follow your breath to the still place that leads to the invisible path that leads us home. Sounds like a Buddhist monk. The Blessed Anna Maria Taigi, a saint, when she was beatified in 1920, made a saint, In the decree, what they said was, among other gifts, the most remarkable was that for a space of 47 years, she saw a kind of sun in whose light she described things at hand, things afar, foresaw the future events, scrutinized the secrets of the hearts and the most hidden and most inward impulses. Sounds like a remote viewer to me. Sounds like what Planck, Einstein were saying. How about the psychics themselves? Well, you can't get anybody better known than Edgar Cayce. Probably the most heavily documented, I would say, remote viewer in history. And in a reading that he gave in 1923, when they asked him, how do you do this? What's going on? He said, quote, "In this state, the conscious mind becomes subjugated to the subconscious, superconscious or soul mind, and may and does communicate with like minds, and the subconscious or soul force becomes universal. From any subconscious mind, information, note that, information may be obtained either from this plane or from the impressions as left by individuals that have gone on before, as we see a mirror reflecting direct that which is before it." That, I can tell you from my own experience, my own remote viewing work, is exactly what the really talented remote viewers say. And as you can see, just like Einstein, Cayce is talking about this greater totality, this universal consciousness, the non-local aspect of consciousness. And let me give you some examples out of remote viewing, since I have been doing remote viewing research. I'm one of the people who created remote viewing. I've been doing it for now 60 years. Here's a remote viewing by a young woman who worked for me in the Submarine Deep Quest project, which you can see on my website. I actually see it happen as it was filmed. She'd never heard of remote viewing, had never done a remote viewing, didn't know anything about remote viewing. And I asked her to participate in a remote viewing. And here you see her picture, a target that was selected after she did the remote viewing. It was randomly selected, not by me. I didn't know at the time what the target was. Nobody knew. This is a precognitive remote viewing. And above, you see her drawing. And it's exactly the same. It's a bridge across a creek in a park. Now think about that. So what I think this is telling us is that you can learn to do this. This is possible as a learnable experience. I'm going to talk about that in another podcast, exactly how you can do this. But today, what I want to focus on is this similarity between the scientists, the spiritual leaders, the remote viewers, the psychics. Here's another one. I showed this last week's podcast. This is a remote viewing while he was asleep, having a lucid dream of Joe McMoneagle. Now on the left you see his picture, and on the right you see the target that was selected. And look how similar they are. These are ordinary people doing something extraordinary, having extraordinary experiences, because non-local consciousness is available to all of us, because we are a manifestation of non-local consciousness. So these experiences spiritual, known for centuries, millennia. Things like meditation that I talked about last week. Creative genius as it occurs in any generation. These are experiences of this non-local aspect of consciousness. And they always are notable for their sense of connectedness and this timeless wholeness outside of space-time. So the point I'm trying to make is that we're in a time of transition. We're beginning to understand that there is an aspect of consciousness that is not space-time limited. We see it in the near-death experiences. We see it in the reincarnation work. We see it in the remote viewing work. We see it in the healing work. We see it in the creativity. So how does the non-local become local? Neuroscientists Marc Beeman and Edward Bowden of Northwestern University and John Cunios of Drexel University may have made a breakthrough. They have been studying problem solving, which requires what they call insight. That is, it requires some kind of a perception, I would call it non-local perception, which is what you have to make contact with or open to. And you do this while you're in a magnetic resonance imaging device, an MRI. So they're actually looking at your brain while you're solving this problem that can't be solved just by intellectual reasoning. And this research has revealed that the creative moment of illumination, when the problem was solved, seems to occur in a region of the right hemisphere anterior superior temporal gyrus. And here's a picture of an image from the MRI. And I want to stress, this has been going on now for some time. Just to give you an example, in the 3 years between 2006 and 2009, there were over 1,000 papers written on psychophysical self-regulation, leading often to the experience of non-local awareness that were published in peer-reviewed journals in science, which is science's benchmark. If you go to PubMed, the National Medical Library, and you search on meditation, search on that word, you'll get there's more than 10,000 papers. So this is a burgeoning part of science, although there's not much reporting about it in the general corporate media. Even more important, I think, or equally important, there are hundreds of papers now, and I've talked about this in some earlier podcasts, that describe non-physical linkage amongst humans, animals, birds, insects, as well as mental influence interactions between species, the efficacy of therapeutic intention, transactions that do not involve standard sense perception. Collectively, all of this is telling us that a change in paradigm is afoot. Now, you hear a lot of people who do think about this and talk about it, talking about quantum mechanics. Here's an example. Michael Garfield, an author of a well-known book on quantum biology, which is a whole field that has just emerged in recent years, and he says life is a molecular process. Molecular processes operate according to the quantum playbook. Therefore, life is a quantum process. So this work, I also want to point out, that the scientists are doing supports the shamanic and spiritual traditions that have been reported as long as people have been keeping records. Every civilization, for instance, talks about meditation in some form. So we're not only dealing with science, we're not only dealing with music, we're dealing with the arts, we're dealing with spiritual impressions, but we're dealing with a tradition that dates back thousands of years. Now, I want to talk about something unusual about these science papers that I don't hear anybody talking about, to be honest. And that is that the papers, first of all, are in many different disciplines: medicine, psychology, psychiatry, anthropology, parapsychology, physics. And because science is kind of like a silo for many scientists, that is, they don't make very many references to research outside of their own discipline community. So what we're looking at, and the point I'm trying to make, is that you have people who are working in very different disciplines who are reporting their research, but that collectively they're all beginning to say the same thing. They're independently arising lines of inquiry that are merging into this new paradigm that is coming out. And the central insight is that all life is interconnected and interdependent, and that we live within a biosphere, not on it. All of this, whether objective or experiential, whether science or something that someone's experienced, they all are different manifestations of the same process. And it's modulated by context and intention. That is, a spiritually seeking person is looking for a religious experience. A scientist is looking for an insight into something that can change science. But each of these manifestations, as I've tried to illustrate to you, all connect at the idea of non-local consciousness, something that emerges out of conscious awareness. So here's a speculative model. And I note that it's speculative, but it's suggested by this research, by the spiritual paths, by the observation of saints, seers, and scientists. The non-local domain is a domain of information, in which space and time have an informational meaning. But space and time are not limitations, that they are in what we call reality. They are informants. This is a domain of information in which conscious intention shapes, in our case, space-time. So reality is a manifestation of consciousness. And this new paradigm is quite different. The physicalist, materialist consciousness paradigm said the mind is solely the result of physiological processes. Each person's consciousness is a discrete entity. There's no communication possible except through defined physiological senses. Talking, listening. Consciousness dwells entirely within the time-space continuum. That's the old paradigm. This new paradigm that is emerging says only certain aspects of the mind are the result of physiological processes. You look at the near-death research, you look at the reincarnational research. Consciousness is causal. Physical reality is its manifestation. All consciousness, regardless of its physical manifestation, is linked, entangled, might be another way to say it. Some aspects of consciousness are not limited by space-time continuum at all. That's how I was able to find archaeological sites that were completely unknown and either forgotten or no one knew where they were, and yet remote viewers could not only locate them, but could describe down to fractions of an inch what would be found there. Functionally, metaphorically, this emerging paradigm could be likened to the workstations in a biotelematic network. Our interactions with the network take place at many planes, from the physical to the non-local. And just as in any network, from electronic to biological, individuals both inform and influence as they are informed and influenced. We are in this interconnected, interdependent matrix of consciousness. And I think it's important. We should not fear this confluence of science and spirituality. I think it represents a move toward wholeness and wellness. We should embrace that we are linked into this interdependent, interconnected network. And the reason that I emphasize this so strongly is that when you recognize this interdependence, you understand why fostering well-being is so important. Why it makes a difference that the choices you make, the policies governments make, have enormous effect if they do or don't recognize the matrix of consciousness. We are coming up to a point where each of us is going to make a choice. We're either going to choose somebody who does not recognize the matrix of consciousness, or we're going to choose someone who does. The choice is up to us. And the choice we make will determine the future we have.